this early constraint has further influenced me to often work with data in a very handmade way. And so you'll see this influence through some of the projects that I'll touch upon today. And using this lo-fi approach, I will also aim to explore ways of presenting data that, besides being legible, are more memorable and more expressive to a layperson audience who might just be learning about data for the first time. So that could mean making data danceable. And I'm not, we'll see how this video never seems to work on Zoom, but you can sort of get the gist. Danceable, like this project as the first data artist in residence at Facebook, where I converted a month of a couple's interactions on Facebook timelines into dance steps and bringing their digital dance across timelines into a physical space. Or it could also mean, okay, great. Making data hoppable, like my open data playground for the South Bank Centre in London, where, again, let's see how this video goes, where hopscotch games were created from open data sets in order to communicate how open data sets are online for anyone to interpret and play with however they choose. And that's how people interacted with the hopscotches. They were dancing and running across them and just doing whatever they wanted with them. And it could also mean projects that are touchable and wearable, like this art commission I created with Miriam Quick, where we explored physical ways of communicating open air quality data from Sheffield in a memorable, experiential way for a citizen audience who might not be interested in air quality or data in general. So one part of the project presented weeks of particulate matter data as something you could touch and wear. And then the other part communicated a day of pollution levels in Sheffield through glasses that would make your vision more or less polluted and hazy depending on the data. So yeah, so you can see that I really like to experiment with how to present data and information. But with all of this experimentation, one of the projects that made the biggest impact in regards to reaching a wider, often uninitiated audience was my collaboration with Georgia Lupi, a New York-based information designer. And we met only twice in person when we decided to collaborate, because we actually have a lot in common. And the biggest thing is that we don't code, but we both prefer to work with data in this very handcrafted analog way, which is kind of different to how many people do kind of embark on the data visualization process. And so we decided to challenge ourselves. Could we get to know each other better through our data alone? But we had one issue, which is that we lived on completely different continents. So how could we create an off-screen collaboration? And so with this, our greatest challenge, long distance, was our biggest asset. And so together we came up with this project we call Dear Data, this year of sending each other hand-drawn data postcards back and forth across the Atlantic. So the way this worked is starting in September and lasting a year, every week we would collect our personal data around a shared topic, like some of the things that you see on screen. Then at the end of the week, we would spend time analyzing our data, then draw our visualizations and their annotations on a postcard. And then when we were finished, we would drop the postcard in our mailbox, in our post box, and we would wait with our fingers crossed. And then if all went well, the postcards would hopefully arrive. Yeah, I keep getting the rainbow ball, like spinning wheel for whatever reason. Zoom just kills my computer. Okay, so if all went well, the postcard would arrive at the other person's address and we'd grab a coffee, sit down with a postcard, and then just read and learn more about the other person's life. And so every week, the postcards had the same structure. So the front had just the drawn data, and then the back had an address and stamp, and then a legend explaining how to read our drawings. And through this format, every week became an exploration of this small data that was very human and personal due to the inherent imperfections, where even our choices and data collection of what we chose to include and not to include function as this unique representation of each person, where over the year, the whole project became a fragmented self-portrait sent to the other. So just for those of you who might not have ever heard of the project, and so you can get a sense of how the year unfolded, I'll just flip through a couple of the weeks in more detail, where we started the year gathering data on how often we checked the clock for the time that week, so kind of an esoteric data set. And then for the second week, we tracked how we moved around our cities. And so we used an app on our phones to gather this data, but it was the only time we used an external app to track us, as we felt we weren't really in control. And so as weeks progressed, we mainly explored themes requiring manual data collection, where we were trying to move beyond the usual quantified self data into something more akin to personal documentary, where we tried to use data capture to make sense of our world, to connect and be present in our day, and then also to create a souvenir of our lives to then send to the other. And so then as we went through the year, we would gather data on all sorts of topics, like lighthearted topics like our drinking or our swearing, which is on screen. Or we would experiment with trying to capture through data the most fleeting of emotions, like trying to track a week of our laughter, which is an almost impossible pursuit. And then we also extended the project beyond only real-time data gathering. So we would move to weeks where we surveyed parts of our lives for the other, like surveying our collection of books, which is on screen, or our music collections, our wardrobes, and so on. And then, since gathering data on your behavior inherently changes your behavior, we also tried performative data tracking, where we tried to gather particular data sets in the hope the data gathering would make us change our behavior in a positive way, like trying something new, which is on screen, or smiling at strangers and being nicer to the people around us. And so, after a year, the project finally ended, and it culminated in these 52 weeks of personal data sets and custom visualizations. And so examples of some of mine are seen on screen. Now, that was like a very quick run through, but there's a book about the project out there if you want to read more about it in detail. And then also, another cool thing that's come from the project, although, is that the original postcard collection and sketchbooks were acquired as part of the permanent collection of MoMA in New York in 2016. And um, it's finally on display in their new galleries for the next year and a half. So this is the first time they've been on display since then. So if you ever get to New York in the next year and a half, they'll be there. And so those are two really nice responses to the project. This was just a personal project for us. But one thing that has excited us even more, that is like really a nice thing, is that we found that this manual domestic way of introducing people to data resonated with them. And we've also received emails from people starting Dear Data correspondence projects of their own, or who use it as part of their teaching materials from primary school to university and beyond to help students learn to collect and present data. So really a wider audience connected with this project in a way that we never anticipated. And we think one reason this response is so positive is that people maybe see this as a new way of documenting and better understanding their world, where some people document through taking photos or writing journals, and others, like me, document with data, spreadsheets, and tick marks. And this documentary approach feels like the complete opposite of the often cold perception of big data, where now data and data gathering can be seen as part of our human experience. And this response compelled us to release a second book, Observe, Collect, Draw, this visual journal that most ages and abilities can use to document their lives through gathering and drawing their own data. So we decided to create this journal that would explain this process to a data newcomer, where we give them drawing and data collection prompts they can then follow. And like one nice thing from this is that we're seeing the journal take on a life of its own online with a new community of data collectors. So that's another nice thing about this. So this project, it did end a few years ago, but it's 2020 now, with all that means. And so in 2020, this project has really seemed to chime with a lot of people, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, as during the first lockdowns, it felt like we just saw hundreds of people getting in touch, trying to use this method to make sense of their days and their anxieties and to try and cope in different ways. And where also the mail art aspect seemed to work perfectly for remote learning, where students were sending data postcards to their classmates as they study from home. And this is a MoMA at home learning video that they sort of talk about the process for kids stuck at home in the US during lockdown. And MoMA also asked us to promote the use of the format by crafting a special 53rd postcard this past May. So this is a week of lockdown connections. And so this is Georgia's postcard, where she experimented with a hand-sewn manifestation of the connections that in her life were mostly virtual. So she was living on her own. And so that was the challenge for her. And then mine documented a different challenge, a very stressful in-person connection, which it was this mix of looking after my 2-year-old daughter, and then these constant childcare handover conversations I had with my husband as we were both trying to work and look after her full time. So, it was still nice to get back to this ritual of posting and taking these photos, even if the world was completely different and our lives were completely different this time around. Um, so it has been heartening to see this update, 2020's response to the project, particularly since this is the year that it seems like many people have passed from only just instead of just a few people being involved in data, and many people are now the sort of people who know about R rates and can make repeated calculations of who will win the US presidency from like week-long drip feeds of US election stats. But how can we make sure that we're all data literate as a population and make more people interested in data in general? Well, I think first we really need to start by making people just understand how to personally relate to data. When you're confronted with this, for some people, when you're confronted with a sea of never ending infection rate ratios and nonstop tables of US counties updating ballot counts that I've been looking at a lot over in November, it can be overwhelming and it can feel much more welcoming to start small on your scale, looking at your interests in your life. And so this small scale can be a friendly stepping stone to bigger picture conversations about data's place in our culture and society, data privacy, and so on, where by starting small, you can help people learn to see the world with the eyes of a data collector and help them better navigate this data filled world we live in. And this small approach that I'm talking about here that we championed with the Data Project, it has really impacted a lot of my recent work. And so for the rest of the talk, I'll just share some of these projects with you now. So firstly, for me, one of the biggest takeaways from Dear Data was the realization that the data Georgia and I sent to each other was always just a starting point for deeper conversation. And I've been extending this mindset in my personal practice, where instead of starting a conversation between two people, I'm using data to start conversations with a community, where I've found that respectful data collection reminds a community they're important and valued, and where by using this data to create an artwork, I feel like immortalizing and commemorating their unique patterns and perceptions. And this idea of data as a conversation starter also formed a large part of my work. Well, for this project at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, London, where for 6 months last year, I was the artist in residence, where I was commissioned to explore how to use data as a way to listen and respond to visitors with the intention to make the museum experience more participatory, engaging, and memorable. And as part of this residency, I collaborated with my friend, the data journalist, Miriam Quick. While settling into the residency, I became fascinated by the collection of Royal Navy ship's badges that were on the gallery walls around my studio door. Often witty and playful in their imagery, these ship's badges function as a visual identity of a ship akin to a traditional coat of arms. And while observing museum visitors, I began to see them as a fleet of ships, where each visitor ship brought their unique personality and view of the world as their cargo into the museum. So therefore, it made sense that each visitor ship should be commemorated with their own ship's badge, one made from their personal data. And the fleet of visitors I noticed in the museum was a mix of parents and grandparents looking after young children, pensioners, school groups, tourists, maritime enthusiasts, and members of the Royal Navy. So it might be an audience who might not know much or be interested in data or art for that matter. And so this informed my and our approach to this project. So first, Miriam and I collected data, aiming to create an experience that would appeal to visitors of all ages and also be respectful and thankful of their data contribution. Miriam created surveys appropriate for children and adults that collected a mixture of basic demographic data as well as questions adapted from the Big Five personality tests. And to end the survey, we also asked respondents what single word they'd use to describe themselves. And we collected data over 5 days through setting up a stall where we invited people to take our survey and learn what ship they would be based on their personality. So the survey took a few minutes to fill out, and then when completed, we would use the lo-fi decoding tool on the left to assess their survey responses, determine which ship they would be, and then we give them like a giant literal ship's badge, a giant sticker that I designed of that ship. And then next, we gave participants further context through displaying a tally board showing how many of each ship type took the survey, and color indicated where the survey taker was from. where, over the days and more people took the survey, we ended up with 600 survey responses at the end of it. So we had a lot of data to make this artwork with. And one thing that I found very interesting about this data collection experience is just designing it. It offers multiple points for museum visitors' self-reflection and discovery, and ultimately like talking points for them, where some people who took the survey found it was interesting to reflect upon their answers as they were taking it, to people who were amused or excited about the ship they were, and some weren't. Lots of people wanted to be aircraft carriers, children, but they were lifeboats. So based on their personality, I can't change that. To those who were interested in seeing how their results compared with others in the tally chart. So it offered different openings for all sorts of people to start learning about themselves and about the museum. Now, Miriam's data analysis of the data we had showed nothing out of the ordinary compared to more rigorous personality research. And so in the end, the most evocative part of the survey was the one word visitors used to describe themselves. So we used this as the main mode of organizing our data. With this data in hand, I then had to create an artwork that spoke to the audience I collected data from. So children, parents, and newcomers to data. So I moved away from abstracted data as it didn't feel right for this all ages audience. And so I moved towards a more playful approach, where using the graphic elements and animals found on the ship's badges as my inspiration, I made for sketches and decided that demographic data would inform the external frame of the badge, and then the internal watery scene would be created from visitors' personality scores. And so the final system for turning this data into ship's badges is as follows, where each word used by visitors to describe themselves is represented as a badge. The crown represents the gender breakdown of who chose that word, and then the rope represents the proportion of children to adults for that word. Where for the main section of the badge, each has an animal on it that represents the average agreeableness score for that word, ranging from a lion representing more competitive personalities all the way to the other extreme of being very kind and trusting, represented by a dog. And then the average extroversion score for that word is represented by the objects the animal's holding, where shields and palms obscuring the face represent more introversion, and animals flying flags and blowing their own horns represents higher extroversion scores. And all these objects are found on real Royal Navy ships badges. Then what the animal is sitting or standing in represents the openness score, where the closer to water, they are more open and more unconventional. So going from a fortress or castle down to a pool ring. And then there's more where the weather around the animal represents the average level of neuroticism for the word. So from like being very sunny and stable to kind of stormy weather if you're very often worried. And then the water surrounding the animal represents the conscientiousness score. So calm, smooth seas for tidy, organized people to tidal waves for people who embrace chaos. So you can see here that with all of these design decisions, there's still this intent to tie the design to the meaning of the data, however playful it may be. And so this is just a quick run through what some of the final badges look like, each representing the aggregated responses for each word that these participants used to describe themselves, where every one of the 177 created badges are unique. And I'll just run through a few more. And then this is the final piece on the wall, where this work offered a space for visitors of all ages to enjoy the artwork in different ways. So as a young child to enjoy the animals and the pictures, or an older audience enjoying reading the words and using the legend to decode the data, to data or personality test enthusiasts who are looking at a deeper level, where it functioned on multiple levels for multiple audiences. So yes, that's thinking about data as a conversation, but how else has Dear Data influenced projects? For this, Dear Data was definitely super accessible, but once you do a project like this, you think, how can I take it further? After all, many people might not pick up a book with data in the title. I feel like this might be one thing that might just make some people not even bother. So how do you make a data book that really reaches the data uninitiated or data intimidated? And so I've explored this challenge in the new book I have out with my friend Miriam. I Am a Book, I Am a Portal to the Universe. And so it's just been recently published by Penguin in the UK. Now, I mentioned my friend Miriam previously in this talk. We often collaborate together on art commissions, museum installations, and now publishing books. I oversee the design and she oversees the data and the writing. And then through bouncing ideas back and forth, we meet in the middle and make work that we really couldn't make alone. And this book idea started with a meeting in a cafe in South London in the spring of 2018. And we were both feeling bored with charts, infographics, maybe even hand-drawn personal data projects. And we felt like we were suffering with what we called chart fatigue, or we didn't feel like we were really doing anything new with how we worked with data, and we just felt stuck in a rut. And so our chart fatigue meant we also grew weary of well-worn formats like the infographic book. So, this really innovative format a decade ago that completely transformed the data design landscape. And it's one we've both worked on in the past, but also one that's long since been superseded by online graphics. So, but we both still really love books. So we asked ourselves, how can we make something different than the standard info book? And with all of this in mind, we began to brainstorm new ideas for collaboration while dancing my baby to sleep in a cafe. And we came up with our super book idea. What if we made a book where the book itself is the measuring device? So we began to develop the general concept. The book itself is a measuring device that can be used to measure things, and our working title was The Measuring Book. It's a book for almost everyone, from children age 8 and up to adults. And also our goal was to write for the data uninitiated or data intimidated, so people who wouldn't normally pick up a book with science in the title. So we wanted to be accessible enough for children, but entertaining enough for adults with a bit of bite and humor to it. And finally, our golden rule and biggest constraint: all the data should be represented on a one-to-one scale, printed on the page at actual size. So what does that mean in practice? Well, the book tells you stories about a universe that is dynamic, constantly moving and changing, full of millions or billions of living organisms and countless mysterious things flying through us or away from us. Like the spread, which estimates that based on the book's volume, there's probably about 187,000 relic neutrinos passing through at any one time. And relic neutrinos are subatomic particles left over from the first moments after the Big Bang. So this is all down to Miriam's wonderful research. So by being a measuring device, the book is like a portal to the world around you through which you can see things that were previously invisible. So it's this scientific book, but also a story for both children and adults. Like in this spread, the book flies to the moon, where it gathers a blanket of moon dust as thick as one of its own pages. So in reality, this would take around 200 years, but there's still this magic on the spreads. It's a talking book is flying to the moon. And so for this, we settled for a balance between fact and fantasy. We decided to call data-driven magic realism, where Miriam made sure all the numbers are as accurate as possible and based on peer-reviewed research where possible, but mixed with flights of fancy and playfulness. Where this playfulness was always underpinned through ensuring everything was fully referenced. So this is the small print, a big appendix at the back of the book written by Miriam, where we explain all the background calculations and assumptions behind each spread. But how do we visualize this data? Well, first, we put firm design rules into place from the beginning. The main one being no traditional charts or graphics allowed. So we had an absolute ban on bar and line charts, axis labels, and so on. So none of the trappings of a traditional info book. And then I also set a personal challenge of no hand-drawn data whatsoever, as it wasn't right for this project. I just wanted to kind of set myself a challenge to try something new. Next, we made the rule that the book would only communicate its data using what we're calling its superpowers: its ink, pages, typeface, binding, and more. And we use them to represent meaningful data in as many magical, clever, and witty ways we could think of. So an example of how this might work can be seen where, for at least for the English translation, we use the double O's within relevant words to represent to scale the actual sizes of various animals' eyes. Another key part of the design is that it would be one where the physicality of the book was embraced and interaction was integral to understanding data concepts. Where you might have to drop the book from waist height to understand how fast it moves through the air. Slam it shut as hard as you can to hear how noisy sunshine would actually sound if space was in a vacuum. Or find out exactly how many stars are born and exploded during the time it takes to turn a page. So this is not an ebook and it never will be. And it's 2.5 years of hard work. And did we actually succeed in our goal of making a book that went beyond the usual info book? Well, so far the reviews are coming in and they're looking really positive, which just feels really validating. I'm really proud of that. And really excited that all of this was done by creating a data book without using the word data anywhere except for our bios where it couldn't be helped. And just in case anyone is interested, a little postscript. So you can find our book online. And if you want to know more, have a chat with it. It likes to talk back online, so you can find it there. But just I'll wrap up with one more project that's still in progress and then a conclusion. So yeah, so the focus of the Dear Data project on the small data of our lives has also led me to look closely at the small data that big data is made from. So a single individual in a sea of thousands or hundreds of thousands. So like one of the people behind the numbers of big data. Um, and I'm exploring this topic as an artist in residence with the UK research group People Like You, a group of scientists, sociologists, and anthropologists and artists, looking at the outcomes and consequences of data personalization. And I'm working with Dr. Helen Ward at Imperial, who as part of this research project is focusing on personalization in medicine. And in this residency, through my art practice, I'm researching how the people who work with medical big data perceive the people behind the numbers who consent to their data being used and stored for future medical research. And I started the residency by researching biobanks and also interviewing researchers, investigators, lab technicians, and more to truly understand how these people within the data are seen at every step of this process. And so now I'm beginning to plan a series of artworks communicating my findings. And at this stage, I'm starting with drawing, where I've been mapping the journey of participants' biosamples and data take during this process of data acquisition, where the participant is ultimately exploded into various strands in order to analyze, prepare, and preserve these elements for future research. And then I'm also looking at certain parts of this process in more detail, where I'm trying to illustrate exactly what happens when nurses collect biosamples and measurements from the study participant, extracting a data set from the billions of potential data points that are latent within all of us that ultimately aren't known or given form until they're collected. And I'm also thinking about how to communicate how data is collected from these participants in different formats. And then these different formats are cleaned and structured in such a way that it can then be aggregated with other participants' data. Then I'm also finally figuring out what happens to the participant on the research side, where parts of a person are gathered together and dispersed multiple times and often at the same time to multiple researchers. Where instead of drawing my personal data in order to better understand myself, I'm using the same process of drawing in order to spend time with data to better understand personalization, this process that impacts all of us in many parts of our lives, whether we're aware of it or not. Now, just to quickly sum up some of my key findings from using Dear Data's personal, playful, small data approach to my practice. First, I'm finding success in using data collection as an interface for engaging and responding to a wider community, where it functions as an icebreaker to start more like deeper conversations. And next, from seeing how the Dear Data project was received, I found that warm, emotive, and playful data projects are the way to captivate a wider audience, and one might attract if the end result is abstract, cold, clinical, and algorithmic. And often, moving away from abstract data representations into a new space seems the way to achieve this. And also, I believe in the value of more embodied experiential approaches to representing data, where a reader experiences data directly in front of them on their scale. And further exploration of this approach is vital to moving the data design space forward. And really, my experience working with data using this approach really makes me believe more than ever that we don't have to collect and visualize data for statistical insight, but data is this in-between material, in between many disciplines, where a data set can be a scientific and analytical material data scientists work with, or a cultural artifact that artists might respond to, or a souvenir of an experience as documented through data, or an interface for engaging with a community where they're visualized and elicit completely different responses in these different spaces, but they all of these approaches to working with data ultimately move our perception of data forward. And that's it. Thank you.